Welcome, everyone. It is Tisha Bav afternoon, 2022, and unfortunately, because of the Jewish law restrictions against greeting people, I can't give you a formal warm welcome, but I can just thank you on behalf of our Torah Mitzion Kollel and the Fish Center for joining us this afternoon. My name is Reuven Brand. I am privileged to serve as the Rosh Kollel of the Torah Mitzion Kollel of Chicago, and I'm delighted to share the afternoon together with the Fish Center at Yeshiva University, which is at the forefront of expanding education about the Holocaust across the community. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Mrs. Sari Sheinfeld, an MA candidate at the Fish Center, to introduce our featured speaker this afternoon, Dr. Karlip. It is extremely appropriate for us to be welcoming Dr. Karlip this afternoon, as our presentation is going to focus on an aspect of Tisha Bav, the Jewish traditional day of mourning, which includes within it the Holocaust and all of its horrors, which are a derivative of a long chain of Jewish history calamities, all the way dating back to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. So thank you very much all for joining us, and B'chavod Rav, with great honor and privilege, welcome Mrs. Sheinfeld.
Thank you. I just want to introduce Dr. Karlip. Dr. Joshua Karlip is the Herbert and Naomi Denenberg Associate Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University, where he's taught in Yeshiva College, Stern College, the Bernard Revel Graduate School, and in the Emil and Jenny Fish Center for Holocaust Studies, where he was my personal professor. He also serves as the Associate Director of the YU Center for Israel Studies. His publications to date include the critically acclaimed The Tragedy of a Generation, The Rise and Fall of Jewish Nationalism in Eastern Europe, published by Harvard in 2013, and his forthcoming Eufen Shedbeg, At the Crossroads, Jewish Intellectuals and the Crisis of 1939. Dr. Karlip's current book project, Rabbis in the Land of Atheism, The Struggle to Save Judaism in the Soviet Union, recently won 2 prestigious grants from Moscow. For Center for University Teaching of Jewish Civilization book grant, and the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center research grants. He will be joining us this evening live from Israel. Without further ado, Dr. Karlip.
Thank you very much, Sari. Thank you very much, Rabbi Brand. It's a pleasure. I just have to say that I'm joining you from Yerushalayim, where I have the privilege to be here doing research in a conference coming up. And as a result, I'm post Tisha Bav, which explains my clean shavenness and having eaten. But more about that being in Jerusalem later. For now, I want to get started by sharing a PowerPoint with you. And speaking about today's topic, which is From Tisha Bav to Yom Kippur, the Great Deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto. We all know that Tisha Bav was not just the destruction of the first temple and the second temple, but that it also was the date of many, many tragedies throughout Jewish history. The expulsion from Spain came right before Tisha Bav. World War I began on Tisha B'Av 1914. And the Great Deportation of Warsaw Jewry to Treblinka began on Erev Tisha B'Av 1942. This is the 80th anniversary. We mark today the 80th anniversary of this event, and this event is something that was calamitous and was absolutely horrific, but that few people necessarily know what it was in and of itself. So I'll just say quickly what it was is that Warsaw Jewry was the largest Jewry before the war, which we're going to speak about. There were 400,000 Jews at the height of the Warsaw Ghetto. Between Erev Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, 1942, nearly 300,000 of those 400,000 Jews were dragged to the Umschlagplatz, which was where the trains were, the cattle cars, shoved onto the cattle cars, sent to Treblinka, where they were immediately gassed. This was, one of the largest concentrated slaughters of the Holocaust. A little bit of background before we get to the Great Deportation itself. A little prehistory. Warsaw, by the beginning of the 20th century and on the eve of the Holocaust, was the largest Jewish community in Europe. The only larger Jewish community in the whole world was New York City. There were 375,000 Jews in Warsaw, 30% of the population on the eve of the Holocaust. And many people have compared Warsaw Jewry to a mosaic. There were Hasidim, there were Yiddish-speaking masses, there were leftists, as represented by the Jewish Labor Bund, a socialist group, and there were Poles of Mosaic faith who were quote-unquote assimilationists, people who spoke Polish, were more acculturated, wealthier, and they all lived in the same community. Now, the war began on September 1st, 1939, and Warsaw was one of the areas of Poland that fell to Nazi Germany right away, immediately. And as early as October 1939, the Germans demanded that a Judenrat be formed, and a man named Adam Chernikov was appointed the head of the Judenrat. And this was a year before the ghetto's creation. And here's an image of Chernikov, who went on to head the Judenrat in the ghetto.
Dr. Karlip,
yes.
Can I interrupt just for 1 second, just to let
Please.
everybody know that we will be taking questions for the Q&A portion of the program at the end. All questions should be emailed to info@torahchicago.org. That's info, I-N-F-O, at Torah, T-O-R-A-H, Chicago.org. Thank you.
Thank you. Sari, can you hear me? Is everything clear?
Yeah.
Besides that? Okay,
Yeah.
Excellent. Great.
We hear you.
Now, the ghetto was created a year into the war, in November of 1940. At its peak, the ghetto contained 450,000 Jews. There was an average of 7 Jews per room in the ghetto. And to talk about the tremendous overcrowding, the ghetto, which had 450,000 people in it, only was 2.4% of the city surface area. Now, Chernikov had been on the council, on the Jewish community council before the war. He wasn't considered a great leader of Warsaw Jewry. He was Polonized. He was definitely out of touch, both with the religious Jews as well as with the Yiddish-speaking Jews. And of course, there was a big overlap between the two. And therefore, he wasn't particularly popular in the ghetto amongst the more common people. But nonetheless, it's important to say that he ultimately was a man of integrity, someone who refused to get wealthy on the backs of the Jews in the ghetto, and really did the best that he could under impossible circumstances. There were competing leaderships in the Warsaw Ghetto, and in this regard, Sari was my student, and she can attest to the fact that in my course, I spoke about the balance between how do we assess to what extent conditions in the ghetto were a continuation of pre-war conditions, and to what extent they were caused by more immediate circumstances that the Nazis had caused in the ghetto. Well, in the case of the Warsaw Ghetto, the fact that there were alternative leaderships really was a continuity of this mosaic from the pre-war period. There was the Judenrat, and the Judenrat was led by Chernikov, as well as many other Polonized Jews. And as we said, Chernikov himself was a man of integrity. However, there were people under him who did not have so much integrity. And it really was led by the upper middle class and the wealthy and the Polish speaking. And there was an overrepresentation of Jewish converts to Christianity, especially in the Jewish police, which was related to the Judenrat. In contradistinction, there were Jewish self-help committees that emerged. And the Jewish self-help committees were led by a man named Emanuel Ringelblum. And Emanuel Ringelblum was a historian, he was a historian. He was an activist, a communal activist before the war. He was a socialist Zionist, a member of the left-wing Mitzion, the labor Zionist movement, the left wing, which was more Soviet-oriented. And so he definitely was a Marxist as well as a socialist, combining that with Zionism and with Yiddishism. And as a result, he opposed Chernikov in the Judenrat. And he wanted the self-help committees to be much more democratic, much more representative. And he created house committees. Warsaw was set up through a series of courtyards, and each courtyard had its own house committee. So it was much more representative. Ringelblum also was the founder of the Einik Shabbos Archive. The Einik Shabbos Archive was the clandestine archive in the Warsaw Ghetto whose goal immediately was to document everything in the Warsaw Ghetto for the post-war Jewish community in Poland, so that it would have a record. But in the middle of its task, it switched to a documentation of genocide in the midst of the Great Deportation. So in a sense, Ringelblum, who didn't have kind things to say about Chernikov, was an alternative leader in the ghetto. Now, life in the Warsaw Ghetto between 1940 and November 1940 and July 1942 was a period of starvation and death. Of the 450,000 Jews there, roughly 80,000 perished of starvation. The only way for Jews to survive was smuggling, and there was a lot of smuggling from the Aryan side at great risk. But despite that, there was a rich religious, cultural, and social life somehow going on despite the horror around them. In the summer of 1942, the Einik Shabbos Archive started what it called the 2.5 years project, or 2.5 years report, to talk about what life was like in the ghetto after 2.5 years there. And one of its conclusions was that perhaps the worst was over. Death by starvation and by disease seemed to have leveled out. The population seemed to be surviving. And the general consensus was that the majority of Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto would survive the war. But, as Sam Cassell, the historian of Ringelblum and the Einik Shabbos Archive poignantly wrote, the Nazis had other plans for Warsaw Jewry. There had been rumors starting in the spring of 1942, going into the summer, of gassings, of mass gassings at Chelmno and at Belzitz. There had been even a survivor who came from Chelmno and smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto and gave his testimony to Einik Shabbos. However, Chernikov was promised by the SS that the Warsaw Ghetto was safe. And the consensus in the ghetto was that might happen out in the provinces, but it's not going to happen in Warsaw, which is in the heart of Europe, and that the whole world can see what's going on in Warsaw. So on July 22nd, 1942, Erev Tisha Bav, just a few days after Chernikov had received assurances from the SS that there would be no deportations, he marched into Chernikov's office and ordered him to begin the, quote, resettlement to the east. He demanded 5,000 Jews a day, and he told Chernikov that he was going to hold his wife captive. He was going to kidnap his wife, and he would kill Chernikov's wife if he didn't come up with the people. Chernikov spent the next day and a half running around, speaking to SS officers, trying to get exemptions, especially for the children. But when he failed to do so, Chernikov decided to commit suicide, which he did on July 24th, 1942, leaving behind a suicide note in which he wrote, quote, "They demand me to kill children of my nation with my own hands. I have nothing to do but to die." And he took a cyanide pill and died. Now, this action has been debated. There were his detractors who saw it as an act of cowardice, including Ringelblum, which I don't think is fair. There are also those who question, why didn't he call for physical resistance for the ghetto inhabitants? But what is clear is that Chernikov refused to send Jews to their death and chose death himself rather than participate in the final solution. Now, that date, July 22nd, 1942, initiated a 2-month period of infernal chaos. Thousands were marched to the Umschlagplatz, the train station, daily. Many of them, or most of them, were caught and had no choice and were dragged. Still others were lured by bread and marmalade offered by the Nazis to a starving population, as well as false promises of work in the East. In time, though, everyone knew the truth. One of the most difficult chapters of the Great Deportation, but something that I think we need to speak about, especially on Tisha Bav, is the role of the Jewish police. It was the Jewish police in the ghetto who were charged with coming up with a daily quota. And if they didn't have that daily quota, they themselves and their families would be themselves deported to Treblinka. So the Jewish police turned into bloodhounds in hunting down Jews and sending them to the Umschlagplatz. And all the memoirs speak about the brutality of the Jewish police. Now, there's a recent book has come out about the Jewish police in Warsaw, and it talks about many of them as normal, ordinary, sometimes quite decent people put in an impossible circumstance. But, you know, of course, nuances are lost in a time of great chaos and calamity. And the police are remembered by the survivors in very, very negative terms. Now, it is true that the police, as we said, in the Warsaw Ghetto were, as the Judenrat, were largely from the Polonized class, from the upper middle classes, from the professional classes. There was an outsized representation of converts to Christianity who were forced into the ghetto against their will. And this, you know, this contributed to the gap between the police and the common people, and in many ways made it easier for, in some, you know, in certain key ways, for the police to carry out this terrible mission. Just to contrast this to the Jewish police in the Kovna Ghetto, for instance. In the Kovna Ghetto, virtually the whole Jewish population was Yiddish speaking. There wasn't this large cultural, social divide in the Kollel Ghetto as there was in the Warsaw Ghetto. And in the Kollel Ghetto, the Jewish police were active in the resistance, worked together with the resistance, and actually helped ferret Jews, especially children, into the forest, to the partisans. So it's definitely a very different legacy. Now, there was complete desperation for workshop certificates because the only thing that potentially could save a Jew was a certificate that they work in a German-run workshop. Sometimes, most of the time it worked, sometimes it didn't work. And therefore, increasingly, the population of the ghetto went into hiding. And these hiding places were also oftentimes discovered. Virtually every family, even of people who survived the Great Deportation, lost very close loved ones, lost wives, lost husbands, lost children, lost parents in the Great Deportation. Of those caught in the Great Deportation over those 2 months, nearly all were taken to Treblinka and immediately gassed. That's about 265,000 Jews were taken to Treblinka and gassed. About another 35,000 were murdered in the ghetto, in the roundups, which takes it to about 300,000. By Yom Kippur of 1942, just 2 months later, of the 300 and close to 400,000 Jews in the ghetto, only 70,000 remained. It's important to put this in a little bit of a broader perspective of the Holocaust, that this was 1942 was the height of the, 1943 was the height of the Holocaust. In other words, the Nazis were at the height of their power. There was really virtually nothing at this point the Allies could have done to stop them. And it was reflected in the Great Deportation. Notice that this is not, and I'm not in any way making light of Auschwitz, but this was not Auschwitz in the sense that there was no selection. There were virtually no selections. There were roughly 30, 40 people, out of close to 1 million who came to Treblinka over that 1 year period that it was in operation, who survived. And those people largely survived by being in the Sonderkommando, having to do terrible things, as well as being sent out to other labor forces. But everyone else was gassed. There were no selections. They at this point, the Nazis felt they could afford to murder the strongest, the youngest, etc.
So Dr. Karlip, just reminding anyone who is watching right now who'd like to send over a question, feel free to send an email during the talk at this moment later to info at Torah, Torah, Chicago.org, and we'll be happy for Dr. Karlip to address it afterwards.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Graham. So one of the few survivors, excuse me, of the Great Deportation was a man named Yankel Wernick, who was in his early 50s, and when he was taken to Treblinka and miraculously survived, and he wrote in a memoir later, as many as 80 persons were crowded into each car, talking about the cattle cars, with no way to escape. The air in the cars was becoming stiflingly hot and oppressive, and stark and hopeless despair descended on us like a pall. I saw all of my companions in misery, but my mind was still unable to grasp the immensity of our misfortune. I knew suffering, brutal treatment, and hunger, but I still did not realize that the hangman's merciless arm was threatening all of us, our children, our very existence. And then later on, he writes at 4 p.m., the train got underway again, and within a few minutes, we came into the Treblinka camp. Only on arriving there did the horrible truth dawn on us. Just a footnote that Veronik survived by being in the Sonderkommando, where he was responsible for removing the bodies from the gas chamber, burning the bodies, etc. A year later, in 1943, he participated in the Treblinka uprising and escaped Treblinka. Here are some, I'm going to show you some images from the Great Deportation of the Umschlagplatz. I use these images from the Warsaw Ghetto very sparingly because most of them were taken by the Nazis. Virtually all of them were taken by the Nazis. And quite frankly, I don't think that the victims, these Jews, on the way to their deaths, would have wanted their images to be taken. They wouldn't want to have been immortalized at their moment of greatest agony. But that being said, I just want to quickly show two images so that you can get a sense. Okay, now this is Abraham Lewin. Abraham Lewin is important in terms of the Great Deportation because he kept a diary throughout, and the diary survived. So it's one of the few diaries we have that encompasses the entire Great Deportation. Lewin was a Zionist, he was a Hebraist, and he was a teacher in the Hebraist school system in Warsaw. And this is Lewin with his wife, Toba, before the war. This is the entry of Lewin's diary from August 13th, just a couple days after his wife, Luba, not Toba, his wife Luba was caught up and taken in the Great Deportation. The 23rd day of the slaughter. Today they have taken about 3,600 people from Tobin's warehouses, mostly women and children. Today is Ora's 15th birthday. Ora was his daughter. It's a bleak day in her life and mine. I have never had such a tragic day in my life. I haven't shed a single tear since yesterday. I lay consumed with my pain in the attic. I did not sleep a wink. Ora was muttering in her sleep, "Mommy, don't go without me." Today, after Gusia came, I cried a lot. They throw me out of my apartment on 2 Milna Street. They have probably plundered all my belongings. Those who remain loot and plunder without any scruples. Life turned upside down, a complete ruin in all respects. I will not find any consolation as long as I live. If Luba had died a natural death, I would not be so desperate and sick. But to fall into the hands of such murderers? Have they already killed her? She came out in a light dress, no stockings, with my leather briefcase in her hand. How tragic it is. Our common life, which lasted over 21 years, I met her at the beginning of 1920, ended so tragically. Now I want to speak a little bit about Jewish reactions in the Warsaw Ghetto to the Great Deportation, both while it was going on and in its aftermath. First, I just want to say a few words about the theological reflections of the Piaseczna Rebbe, Rabbi Kalanimus Kalman Shapiro, who Rabbi Brand has spoken a lot about as an expert on. The Piaseczna Rebbe was a profound theologian and thinker. had made his mark in Jewish education before the war in Warsaw. He had experienced the loss of just about his whole family at the very beginning of the war, operated a soup kitchen from his house in the ghetto, and continued to preach and teach to his Hasidim in the ghetto and to offer drashot on Shabbos throughout the time in the Warsaw Ghetto. In one of the Shabbatot before the Great Deportation, Parshat Matot Maseh. So it's, one, we're going back, not Shabbat Chazon, but the week before. He gave a drasha in which he talked about the nature of Kiddush Hashem, and he spoke about the fact that there are types of punishments, there are types of sufferings that come to the Jews as punishments, but there are types that come to the Jews because God himself is suffering. And when God is being attacked, the Jews are attacked as collateral damage, as God's people. And this was a reaction to the great suffering in the Warsaw Ghetto. Another reaction was a literary reaction, and this was the reaction of Rachel Auerbach. Rachel Auerbach was a Yiddish and Polish writer before the war. She found herself in the Warsaw Ghetto. In the Warsaw Ghetto, she became active in the house committees organized by Ringelblum. She ran a soup kitchen in the Warsaw Ghetto, and she also was an active participant in the Einik Shabbos archive, conducting interviews with women in the ghetto, reporting on conditions of the women in the ghetto, especially for the 2.5-year project. Auerbach somehow survived the Great Deportation. She went into hiding on the Aryan side in the winter of 1943 and was already on the Aryan side during the Warsaw Ghetto revolt. Auerbach, I hate these stereotypes, but this is what the Nazis trafficked in and could spell life or death. Auerbach did not have classic Jewish features and could pass as a Pole. So therefore, when she got her Aryan papers, she even bravely came into the ghetto as a Pole to help and do what she could. After the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, she wrote a poem in Yiddish called Yizkor 1943. And in Yizkor 1943, she not only addressed the tragedy, the tremendous loss of an entire Jewish community, but she really attempted to answer the question, how could it happen? There was a lot of guilt amongst the 70,000 survivors in the ghetto. There was guilt, why didn't we resist? Why did hundreds of thousands just go to the Umschlagplatz? After all, we're talking about Jewish police that number in the hundreds. Over a period of 2 months, taking 265,000 Jews to the Umschlagplatz. How could this be? There was a lot of guilt and a lot of soul searching. And Auerbach's response in this poem was that it was akin to a natural catastrophe. Auerbach had been born and raised in a shtetl in eastern Galicia. So she was used to a much more bucolic setting than urban Warsaw. And so she began the poem by saying that she remembers as a child seeing a flood and seeing the houses being swept away by the floodwaters with all the furniture and the people in them. And she says that the Great Deportation was the same. It was akin to a natural disaster. It was a flood that swept over Warsaw Jewry and took the strongest people, the people who generally would have revolted, the underworld figures, the toughs, the youth. It took them all, and they all went as if just drifting away with a natural disaster. Now, there were also political and one might say military reactions. The ZOB, the Jewish Fighting Organization, was founded at the beginning of the Great Deportation on July 28th, 1942, with immediate calls for resistance, which, as we said, did not come in the midst of the deportation itself. But following the deportation, once it ended in November 1942, it reorganized with Mordechai Analevich as its head, and it planned for revolt. And its goal was basically that it would put up physical resistance when the Nazis came to finish the job. Because by November of 1942, there were no illusions that the Nazis would leave the 70,000 Jews alive who were left in the Warsaw Ghetto. It was only a matter of time until they came back to finish the job and to deport the rest. And so when the Nazis came into the ghetto in January 1943, there were the first skirmishes. And of course, as well known, in April of 1943, Pesach, when the Nazis came into the ghetto, they were met with the powerful resistance of the ZOB, which managed to resist for several weeks before the Nazis succeeded in burning the entire ghetto and transporting the overwhelming majority of those who remained to Treblinka and to other camps. Now, the reaction of, let's say, the average Jew in the ghetto was, as we said, a feeling of guilt for not resisting, but a determination to resist deportation. And this helps explain the fact that there was massive support of the ZOB in the ghetto. Now, of those 70,000, Jews in the ghetto, there were only 400 or so active fighters. But those active fighters had the support of the tens of thousands who were in the ghetto. And again, the reason was because, unlike in other ghettos, there were no more illusions. And so, no, they didn't believe that they could win. And the goal wasn't to win. The goal was to defend Jewish honor and to die an honorable death on their own terms, to die going down fighting, going down hiding if they were not fighters, but not to get on the trains and go to Treblinka. So the overwhelming majority of the population that couldn't fight spent months building bunkers to hide. And this time would not come out and would not willingly go to the trains. And in the course that I taught, that Sari took the course, we listened to the riveting testimony of a survivor in Cape Town, Ella Blumenthal, who, as far as I know, is still alive, and God willing, will celebrate her 101st birthday on Shabbat Nachamu. And she talked about the fact that she and her father and her niece were hiding first in an apartment building and then in a bunker. during the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And as she said, we resisted until the very last second and would not get out of the bunkers and would not go, until we had absolutely no choice. Now, I want to just end, with a personal reflection that I have the great zchut, the zchut of being here in Jerusalem, in Yerushalayim, on Tisha Bav. Last night, I had the deeply moving experience of going to the Kollel and seeing thousands of Jews at the Kollel. Jews who ranged in religious observance from Haredim to secular to everything in between, all coming to mourn the Beit HaMikdash, to mourn the historical calamities of the Jewish people, to pray for a better future. And it was an incredibly moving experience to be at the Kollel, to be at the site of the Beit HaMikdash on Tisha B'Av itself, with thousands of other Jews here in Israel. And it led me to last night and this morning saying keynote to think about this gap, between 80 years, between Tisha B'Av 1942, Tisha B'Av 2022. Here it is. I was sitting in Yerushalayim. There were rockets. There are, just as ever, there are people who want to kill us. But of course, the great contrast, there was no one to defend us 80 years ago. Today, we have the state of Israel. But yet, to end with a prayer, that, we fast on Tisha B'Av because the world is still very broken. The Jewish world is very broken. Thank God we have a state of Israel. Thank God our people is not in the place that it was 80 years ago. But there's still so much broken. There's still so much hatred. There's still so much work to be done. So I want to thank both the Fish Center and Rabbi Brandon Torah Mitzion for giving me this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karlip. So let's, if you can turn off that PowerPoint, and then I'll be able to see you. Great, let's see. Oh, great. Okay, great to see you. So we have a couple of questions. The first one coming in: what was the fate of the Jewish police in Warsaw, which is related to an earlier question that came in regarding the question of accountability for any members of the Jewish police in Warsaw after the war?
Okay, these are two great questions. The fate of the Jewish police was overwhelmingly, ultimately the fate of the rest of Warsaw Jewry, the rest of Polish Jewry, and that is, when the Nazis were done doing their work and using the Jewish police for their dirty work, they put them on the trains and they themselves were sent to Treblinka. Some during the Great Deportation, but most later, in January of 43 and in April of 43.
Anything about accountability?
By the way, one thing is important to say, and that is that between January and April of 43, in preparation for the revolt, the ZOB went around the ghetto and executed collaborators, and this included some of the worst of the Jewish police, and
when you say, just maybe clarify for us, when you say collaborators, those are people who are separate from the Jewish police, who were just kind of, because the Jewish police, it sounds like they were following orders. That's different than somebody who was willingly, proactively, right? Is that what you mean? Just to clarify for us?
There were Gestapo informants. There were people who had relations with the Gestapo and were informing on the Gestapo in hope of saving themselves. right, there were also police who were seen as particularly brutal or particularly relishing beating Jews and, going above and beyond. This whole question, by the way, of and this leads to the question of post-war. This whole question of who was a collaborator and who wasn't a collaborator is a very, very complex question, because, Hannah Arendt, for instance, in Eichmann in Jerusalem, wrote that the Judenrats, all the heads of the Judenrats were collaborators, right? And that they were a cog in the wheel of the Nazi murder machine. Yeshaya Trunk in the early 70s wrote a book called Judenrat, in which he said this is absolutely not true, that you had some better Judenrats, heads of Judenrats, you had some worse, but ultimately they cooperated to try to save Jewish lives. And some of them even were willing to sacrifice Jewish lives, right? But none of them were collaborators in the sense of wanting the Germans to win, right? If that's how we define a collaborator, then even these Gestapo informants probably were not collaborators in the worst sense of the definition. Now, post-war, especially in Israel, the question came about, what to do with people, members of the Jewish police or heads of the Jewish police, but especially capos, in the camps, and there was a book that was recently written about this, and the question was, there were trials in Israel, and in the beginning, in the immediate post-war years, and in the immediate years of the creation of the state, in the early 50s. The courts generally found these people guilty, right, and gave them harsh sentences. Later on, starting, in the later 50s and in the early 60s, the view shifted, and the view shifted to the fact that these people were victims themselves. These people were Holocaust survivors themselves. So the line again was very murky. Other questions?
Yeah, the next question that came in is, why did the resistance develop only after the vast majority of Jews had been deported from Warsaw? What prevented the resistance from developing at a time when more could participate in the resistance?
Okay, well, first of all, we have to remember that the Great Deportation, as Rachel Auerbach wrote poetically, but it really took Warsaw Jewry completely by surprise, in the sense that there's basically nothing that it could have done to prepare for the unimaginable, basically, we have to, when we see this Jewry, in a sense, going to its death without resistance, we have to look at it with empathy, and we have to understand that this is a Jewry that had been terrorized for 2.5 years. It was a Jewry that these were Jews who were starving, right? And so there were people who, came out, went into hiding at the beginning of the Great Deportation, and 4 weeks later, without any food, starving, desperate, they just came out and said, look, wherever we go, at least we'll get this bread and jam and some water, right? The Nazis also preyed on the Jewish family feeling. And so there were many, many instances of families, of people who chose to go with their loved ones to the trains, even if they didn't have to go themselves. And so, we have to understand that in the midst of that horrible chaos, it would have been very difficult to organize successful revolt. That's number one. Number two, we do have to understand that there were some internal reasons, right? There were bitter political internal rivalries, right, between these different Jewish youth groups, between the Zionists, the Socialist Zionists, the Bundists, the Communists, right? And they all had to table those rivalries in order to get together and work together. But, they were willing to do that once the Great Deportation began. But the other major question is, where are they going to get weapons? Right? We have to remember this is the great tragedy of Jewish powerlessness during the Holocaust. They're in the ghetto, they're, incarcerated in the ghetto, where are they going to get ammunition? The Polish underground, the various Polish underground groups were not particularly friendly. Some of them were actively hostile. And so it took a matter of months for them to organize to get enough weaponry to even, think of having somewhat of having an effective revolt. So those are all the reasons.
Okay, Dr. Karlip, before I'm going to turn it back to Sari for one more question and then to Dr. Pilnik to close. So two things. First is someone by the name of Joseph Schwartz wrote in, I'm with my great aunt right now. The fast ended here in Cape Town, and he sent a picture of Ella Blumenthal. So Baruch Hashem,
Baruch Hashem.
So that's number one.
Excellent.
Second is, I'll toss you one more question and then hand it over to Sari. The question of, in your opinion, based on your research, to what extent was the overwhelming majority of the population of the Warsaw Ghetto supportive of this underground uprising movement? And to what extent did they engage actively or passively? How much were people supportive of this movement toward revolt?
Overwhelmingly supportive. This is very different. When I taught my course, and Sari, was in the course, I contrasted the Warsaw Ghetto with the Vilna Ghetto, right? And in the Vilna Ghetto, there was an underground organization, the FPO, and there was an attempt at a revolt at the time of the liquidation of the ghetto, and it failed because the overwhelming majority of the ghetto population was not in favor. And the reason for that was that in the Vilna Ghetto, there was horror and mass death at the beginning in 1941, when the Germans came into Vilna, right? 2/3 of the Jewish population had been murdered within 6 months. But in January 1942, a period of relative stability began, and the ghetto became productive, and that lasted for a year and a half. And the head of the ghetto, who was in this case the head of the Jewish police, Jacob Gens, remained in charge until the very end, unlike Chernikov, who committed suicide at the beginning of the Great Deportation. And the Jews really were being, or at least many of them in the Vilna Ghetto, were being deported to work camps in Estonia. So given the choice between, taking their chances at survival in work camps, versus basically suicide through revolt, the overwhelming majority chose deportation. In the Warsaw Ghetto, on the other hand, there was no mass murder at the beginning, but then came the Great Deportation in the summer of 1942. There were no illusions, right? And everyone knew in January 1943, when the Nazis come back, they're coming back to take people to Treblinka, and it means sure death. So there was a feeling of, we have nothing to lose. It's not like, we have a choice between a possibility of life versus a revolt in which we're going to go down. We're going to go down in a blaze of glory. It was either revolt and die on our own terms or be dragged to the Umschlagplatz. So the overwhelming majority of Jews were supportive. How did they express that support? Largely by, first of all, by not thwarting the ZOB. Right, by not thwarting the ZOB, even though they knew that it would mean that the Nazis would come in and destroy the ghetto, right? And remaining in their hiding places, refusing to go to the Umschlagplatz, under any circumstances, basically until the very end, when they had absolutely no choice. And number three, when they were being smoked out. And number three, by supporting the ZOB in any way that they could. Ella Blumenthal talks about the fact that members of the ZOB would come into the apartment building at night where they were hiding and, ask for donations and sometimes demand things, but they would give it willingly. Whatever they had, they would give willingly. So that, those are the ways that they supported the ZOB.
Okay, just one clarification, just that Ms. Blumenthal's nephew is Ram Roth. Sent that in. It was forwarded to us. Okay, the next question is, how is it possible that the people were starving and dying in the Warsaw Ghetto, and at the same time, there were cultural activities taking place, such as theater and opera?
This is one of the great enigmas, in a sense, of the Holocaust. First of all, it's important to say that not everybody was starving to death. there was, and in the Warsaw Ghetto, unfortunately, there was great, just as there was disparity before the war, in extremis, there was also disparity. A lot of the disparity, though, in the Warsaw Ghetto between, let's say, those who were doing comparatively okay versus the ones who were literally starving on the streets had to do with, where they lived before the ghetto was created. So the ones who ironically did the best were the Jews who lived in the quarter where the ghetto was created because they already had an apartment, right? The ones who had to move from another place in Warsaw, oftentimes had to lose most of their property in the transport. And the Jews who came from the surrounding Shtetl, and were forced into the ghetto were generally the worst off. And they were the ones who tended to be the most starving. So there were, and also some people, there was a nouveau riche, ironically enough, of smugglers, a small stratum. But, so not everyone was starving. But, in terms of the cultural life, this was not by and large, the ones, this new wealthy class, these were, in terms of those, these were people like Ringelblum, who lived in Warsaw before the war, who had been cultural activists, and they were determined to keep Jewish life going, and we have to understand this as a form of resistance. The physical resistance, throwing a Molotov cocktail is, and certainly a very important form of resistance, but it's only one form of resistance. And, another form of resistance, and truthfully, a much more widespread form of resistance, and something that more people were capable of, was holding on to their humanity, holding on to their Jewish identity. Because we have to remember that the Nazis, while their ultimate goal was to murder the Jews, the goal was to dehumanize them in the process. And so, there was a determination on the part of so many of these Jews not to be dehumanized and not to be stripped of their culture and their identity along the way. And so, with their last strength, they participated in theaters and they went to performances, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karlip. We are so grateful for you taking the time this evening at this very, very late hour for you. I'd like to turn to Dr. Shay Pilnik, Director of the Fish Center, for a few words.
Thank you, Sari.
Dr. Karlip, thank you very much for joining us at close to 2 o'clock in the morning Israel time on Yud Aleph B'Av, actually, in Israel.
Yes.
But this was not in the original plan, and for allowing our community to reflect on the Warsaw Ghetto and its destruction. In our community, in the Fish Center, and by extension in the YU community, we mark Yom HaShoah. We also mark International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is a little bit more recent. These are dates that look at the Holocaust as an unprecedented event in the history of the Jewish people and the world. But in our center, and this is something we share in common with Kollel Torah Mitzion, we would like to link the catastrophe of the Holocaust to the other catastrophes that took place in the history of the Jewish people as a way of looking at the Holocaust from a Jewish perspective and looking at it as a part of the story of the Jewish people. So thank you so much for allowing us to be part of this program. Now for some credits. I wanted to thank the two people who took the lead on this program. Rabbi Reuven Brandt, I wanted to thank you and to recognize your leadership from Kollel Torah Mitzion in Chicago, and also to thank Sari Sheinfeld, our MA student at the Fish Center. From the team at Kollel Torah Mitzion, I wanted to thank Renee Rosenberg and Tracy Schultz, and also from the Fish Center to thank Hodaya Blau, who helped us to coordinate this event. Let me also thank the rabbis and congregations that decided to join us this evening, and I wanted to thank them for sharing the announcement about this program with their constituents. Rabbi Zev Goldberg from Young Israel of Fort Lee, New Jersey, Rabbi Daniel Rapp from East Denver Orthodox Synagogue, Rabbi Daniel Buskila from Westwood Village Synagogue in Los Angeles, Rabbi David Cyril from Congregation Adas Yeshurun in Augusta, Georgia. Rabbi Daniel Cohen from Congregation Agudat Shalom of Stamford, Connecticut, Rabbi Eli Kol from Young Israel of Stamford, Connecticut, and lastly, Rabbi Eliezer Schreier from Congregation Bnei Shuron in Teaneck, New Jersey. I hope you continue to have an easy fast and a meaningful Tisha B'Av. Thank you for joining us, and also thank you for considering to join our future partnerships between the YU Kollel Torah Mitzion,